She didn't cry when he walked out. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood in the doorway of the house they had built together, holding a 6-week-old baby against her chest, watching the tail lights of his car disappear into the dark. And in that moment, with the weight of a child she would now raise alone pressing against her heartbeat, Claire Matthews made herself one silent, unbreakable promise that she would never let this break her. Not him. Not this. Never. When Michael walked out the door, he didn't just leave his wife. He left her with a newborn baby, unpaid bills, and a broken heart. 5 years later, he stood on her doorstep again, but this time, he was the one begging. Claire Matthews grew up in a small town called Hargrove, tucked into the Blue Ridge foothills of Western Virginia, where everybody knew your name and your business, and the biggest events of the year were the county fair in August and the Christmas parade on Main Street in December. She was the second daughter of a retired school principal and a woman who worked double shifts at the local medical clinic to make sure her girls had everything they needed. Claire was not the kind of girl who dreamed of wealth or fame or luxury. She dreamed of something quieter, something warmer, a home that felt like safety, a love that felt like air, the kind you breathe without thinking, the kind you only notice when it is suddenly, completely gone. She met Michael Turner when she was 23 years old, fresh out of a community college in Roanoke, where she had studied business administration, working the front desk at a property management company downtown. Michael walked in on a Thursday afternoon in October wearing a gray blazer and a confident smile, asking about a one-bedroom rental on Maple Street. He was 27, tall, with brown eyes and the kind of easy charm that made people want to listen when he talked. Claire was not easily impressed. She had grown up watching her mother work 2 jobs without complaint, and she had developed early a finely tuned radar for people who were more interested in how they appeared than in who they actually were. But there was something about Michael Turner that made her look twice, and looking twice was the beginning of everything. The beginning of the love and the beginning of the pain, though she would not understand that for years. They dated for 18 months. Michael was attentive in the early days, the kind of man who remembered what you ordered on your first date and showed up with your favorite flowers for no particular reason at all. He told Claire she was the most grounded woman he had ever known. He told her she made him want to be better. He met her mother, shook her father's hand with a firm grip, and called her parents Mr. and Mrs. Matthews until they both insisted he use their first names. Claire's older sister, Renee, pulled her aside at a family barbecue that first summer and whispered, "Don't mess this one up." Claire laughed. She didn't think she would. It never crossed her mind that she would be the one who had to worry about that at all. They got married in June, 2 years after they met, in a small ceremony at a garden venue outside of Roanoke with 70 guests and string lights threaded through the oak trees above them. Claire wore a simple ivory dress she had found at a consignment bridal shop for $340, and she looked more beautiful in it than anyone could have in a dress that cost 10 times as much. Michael cried when she walked down the aisle. Her mother cried from the moment the music started. Her father held himself together through the processional and through most of the ceremony, and then let 2 quiet tears slide down his face during the vows before he looked away and cleared his throat like a man who had made a decision. It was, by every measure, a perfect day, the kind of day that becomes the standard against which all other days are measured, without you ever meaning for it to. The first 2 years of their marriage were not easy, but they were honest. Michael worked as a sales representative for a mid-sized manufacturing company, and Claire had transitioned into an administrative coordinator role at a healthcare staffing firm. Their combined income was enough, not lavish, not comfortable in the way that removes all worry, but enough to cover their lives and leave a small margin for saving. They rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Roanoke and talked about buying a house someday, talked about starting a family, talked about the future the way young married couples do when they still believe the future is simply a matter of deciding what you want and working toward it together. There were disagreements, the ordinary friction of 2 people learning the shape of each other, but they found their way through them. Or at least Claire believed they did. What Claire did not fully see, what she would only come to understand with painful clarity in the years after Michael left, was how quietly his dissatisfaction had been building long before she ever suspected it. Michael had always wanted more than what their life looked like from the inside. Not more love, not more partnership, more status, more money, more of the lifestyle he had spent his 20s watching other people live and convincing himself he was owed. He compared himself constantly to men he barely knew. A colleague who drove a BMW, a neighbor who owned a boat, a college friend who had just purchased a second home in Charlotte. He never said any of this out loud. He never sat Claire down and told her he felt like he was falling behind. He just grew quieter and more restless in the particular way of people who are unhappy but have not yet admitted it to themselves. Present in the room. Somewhere else entirely in his mind. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Claire noticed something shifting in him but could not name it with precision. She assumed it was work stress. She assumed it was the ordinary strain of building a life. She doubled down on the marriage the way women like her are taught to, cooking dinners, asking careful questions, creating space for conversation if you wanted it. She told herself that love was not just the easy seasons. She told herself that you stay, that you figure it out together, that you build through the hard parts rather than away from them. What she did not know was that while she was reinforcing the walls, Michael had already started mapping the exits. Her name was Diane Lawson, and she entered Michael's life the way these things always do, quietly, and dressed up as something that looks harmless from a distance. She was 41 to his 31, a commercial real estate developer who had spent 15 years building a small but impressive empire buying and repositioning properties across northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley. She drove a black Mercedes and wore tailored blazers and moved through a room with the kind of calm authority that comes from never having had to wonder whether the check would clear. She and Michael crossed paths at a commercial property conference in Richmond in March, 8 months after Claire had discovered she was pregnant with their first child. Michael came home from that conference changed. Claire felt the shift immediately. The way people who love someone deeply can feel a change in atmosphere before a single word is spoken. The way a room feels different before a storm, even when the sky still looks clear. He was lighter in an unsettling way, distracted in a direction she had not seen before, checking his phone at odd hours, stepping outside for calls he didn't explain afterward. Claire was 4 months pregnant at the time, tired in the bone-deep way that only the first half of pregnancy produces, and she told herself she was reading too much into things. She told herself her emotions were running high. She told herself Michael was probably just anxious about the financial weight of a child coming. She told herself a great many things in those months that turned out not to be true. The confirmation came in June. Claire was 6 months pregnant, sitting at their kitchen table going through bank account statements, when she found a charge she didn't recognize, a restaurant in Richmond she had never heard of, billed on a Tuesday evening when Michael had told her he was working late. She sat with that charge for 2 full days before she asked him about it. She gave him every possible opening to offer something that made sense. He didn't. He went pale first, then defensive, then cold in a way she had never seen from him in 4 years of knowing him. And in that coldness, that particular kind of silence that has already decided something, Claire understood everything she had been refusing to see. The conversation that ended their marriage happened on a Wednesday evening in late June. Their daughter, Lily, would be born 11 weeks later. Claire had spent the day preparing for what she needed to say, organizing her thoughts, choosing her words with the same deliberate care she brought to everything she did, holding on to the belief that even the hardest conversations could be navigated with dignity if both people were willing to show up to them honestly. She was wrong about that, not because she lacked dignity, but because Michael had already made his decision well before she said a single word, and the conversation he had come prepared for was not the one she had planned to have. He told her about Diane. Not everything. Not the full picture. Not then, but enough. He said he had developed feelings for her. He said he wasn't certain the marriage was working anymore. He said he needed space to figure out what he actually wanted from his life. Claire sat across from him at their kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, her stomach round with his child, and she listened to every word without interrupting. When he was finished, she asked him one question. Is this really what you want? And Michael Turner, the man who had cried watching her walk down the aisle in an ivory dress 3 years before, the man who had shaken her father's hand and meant it, looked at the table instead of her face and said, I think so. That was the moment Claire Matthews learned what it feels like to have the floor disappear while you are still standing on it. Michael moved out 3 weeks later. He did not move into his own apartment. He moved directly into Diane Lawson's house, a 4,000 square foot colonial in a gated community outside of Winchester, Virginia. with a wraparound porch and a 3-car garage and a wine cellar installed in the basement. Claire found out through a mutual friend who had driven past the neighborhood and recognized Michael's truck sitting in the driveway. She did not call him. She did not drive there. She did not send a message. She sat in the apartment, her apartment now, and held that information alone for the rest of the evening. She let herself cry for exactly one night. One night, and then she was done, because she did not have the space to fall apart. She had a baby arriving in 9 weeks. She had rent to pay. She had a life that needed rebuilding from rubble, and the rubble was not going to move itself. Lily Grace Matthews was born on a Tuesday morning in September, at 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with her mother's dark eyes, and, in one of life's smaller cruelties, her father's mouth. Claire's mother drove up from Hargrove and stayed for the first 2 weeks, sleeping on the couch and washing bottles and holding Lily in the rocking chair at 3 in the morning so Claire could get 2 consecutive hours of sleep. Renee flew in from Atlanta and stayed for 10 days after that. Michael came to the hospital on the day Lily was born. Claire had not prevented him from coming, because whatever he had done to her, Lily was his daughter, and Claire had already decided, firmly, without drama, that she was going to be the kind of mother who did not let her own pain become her child's inheritance. He held Lily for 20 minutes, said she was beautiful, and left. He did not come back for 3 weeks. The months that followed were the hardest of Claire's life, and she has never said so publicly because she is not the kind of woman who performs her suffering. But they were. She was recovering from childbirth, while waking every 2 to 3 hours through the night. She returned to work at 10 weeks postpartum not because she was ready, but because their savings had been nearly exhausted and the unpaid debts Michael had left behind. A credit card balance he had been running up without telling her, a car payment she had not known existed, a medical bill from February, came to just over $9,000. She did not tell her parents the full amount. She handled it the way she handled everything in those years, quietly, one payment at a time, without asking anyone to witness it. Michael paid child support. He was legally required to, and he did, which Claire acknowledged as the minimum floor of his obligations, and nothing more. He saw Lily on the court-established schedule, every other weekend, alternating holidays. He and Diane were now openly a couple, photographed at charity events in the Washington area, Diane's name appearing in business publications for a major commercial development project worth $12 million. Someone sent Claire the article. Not out of cruelty, she believed, just out of that particular social awkwardness that makes people share things they immediately regret sending. Claire looked at the photograph for a long, steady moment. Then she closed the browser and went to pick Lily up from daycare. What nobody ever fully captures about rebuilding, what the inspirational posts and the comeback narratives always skip past, is how genuinely slow the process is. It is not a series of triumphant moments. It is a Tuesday afternoon when the daycare calls because Lily has a fever and you have a presentation you cannot reschedule, and you have to decide in under 5 minutes which fire to put out first. It is a Friday evening when Lily is at Michael's for the weekend, and the apartment is quiet in a way that feels like a question you do not have an answer to yet. It is a grocery store run at 9:30 at night because that is the only hour available to you, and you are standing in the cereal aisle trying to choose between 2 boxes, and you start crying without quite meaning to, and then you understand why. Because you are 28 years old and exhausted and doing all of it alone, and no one told you it would feel so specifically like this. But Claire Matthews was not the kind of woman who stayed in the cereal aisle. She was the kind of woman who wiped her face, chose a box, and went home and made lunches for the rest of the week. She enrolled in an online accounting certification course during Lily's nap times and after she went to bed at night. She studied at the kitchen table after 10 p.m. with a glass of water and her reading glasses and the particular quiet focus of someone who has decided that where she is right now is not where the story ends. She woke up early, not naturally, not easily, but deliberately, because she had made a decision that every morning she got up before the world expected her to. She was choosing herself. She did it until it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like character. By the time Lily turned 1, Claire had completed her accounting certification. By the time Lily turned 2, she had moved into a financial coordinator role at a regional healthcare network, earning 20% more than her previous salary. She relocated from the Roanoke apartment into a small 2-bedroom rental house in a quiet neighborhood that had a fenced backyard, which she had specifically required because she wanted Lily to have somewhere to run. While Claire Matthews was constructing her life one careful decision at a time, Michael Turner was living what appeared from the outside to be the life he had always imagined for himself. He and Diane Lawson settled into the Winchester house with the ease of two people for whom money had already resolved most of the problems money is capable of resolving. Diane's commercial real estate business continued to grow in those early years. Michael left his sales position and joined her company in a business development role, a move that came with a six-figure salary, a company car, and a professional title that had the kind of weight to it that he had spent his entire 20s striving toward. They traveled to New York for long weekends, and to Miami in January, and to Rome one spring, staying in hotels that cost more per night than Claire's monthly rent. They attended charity galas in Washington, where Michael shook hands with developers and city officials, and the kind of people who had always existed for him, at the edges of a life he was not quite inside. And yet, there is a particular category of emptiness that money cannot fill, and Michael Turner, though he would not have admitted this to a single living person during those years, was quietly beginning to feel it. He and Diane were partners more than they were a love story, compatible in the way that two people who want identical things from the external world are compatible, which is functional but not the same as deep. Diane was brilliant, focused, and almost entirely self-sufficient, qualities he respected and simultaneously felt quietly diminished by. She did not need him. She had never needed him. She had chosen him the way she approached every decision, strategically, because he fit a gap she had identified and decided to fill. As months compounded into years, Michael found himself sitting in her home office doorway on quiet evenings, watching her work, and asking himself in the private interior of his thoughts what exactly they were building together, and whether the word for it was a life or something more like an arrangement. He also thought about Lily, more than he had expected to, more than he would have predicted about himself in the years before she existed. He saw her every other weekend, and those 48 hours were consistently the most uncomplicated time in his adult life. Lily was fierce and funny and imaginative in the way of children who have been raised by someone who takes their interiority seriously. She was fearless on the swing set and dramatic about small disappointments and absolutely certain about her own opinions. She had her mother's stubbornness and her mother's laugh, and every time Michael buckled her into her car seat on Sunday evenings and drove her back to Claire's house and watched her run up the front path without looking back, he sat in his car in the driveway for a minute longer than he needed to before he put the car in reverse. He told himself it was because he missed his daughter. That was true, but it was not the only weight he was carrying in those quiet minutes before he pulled away. He noticed things about Claire, too, on those pick-up and drop-off exchanges, brief, transactional encounters conducted with the specific politeness of two people who have agreed to keep their history from poisoning their child's present. He noticed that she was different. Not harder. That was not the right word. More settled, more fully herself. She stood in her doorway with a directness that had not been there before, the kind of groundedness that does not come from confidence alone, but from having had to find out what you are made of and having gotten an answer you respect. She was not performing anything for him. She was not cold, not warm, not waiting. She was simply and completely elsewhere, and Michael Turner felt that absence in a way he was not prepared for and did not fully know what to do with. The first sign that something was wrong inside Diane's business came in the third year. Commercial real estate operates on timelines and margins that leave very little room for the compounding of complications, and Diane had built her portfolio aggressively in the years before interest rates began their long climb upward, taking on substantial debt against properties whose valuations were now softening. Her flagship project, a mixed-use commercial complex in the Shenandoah Valley that she had been positioning as the centerpiece of her next 5 years, ran into a series of problems that would each have been manageable in isolation but proved destructive in combination. A major contractor dispute froze construction for 4 months and triggered significant penalty costs. A key anchor tenant, a regional medical group that had committed to 20,000 square feet of the building, pulled out of their lease agreement after their own internal restructuring, and the financing structure Diane had built around that anchor tenant began to come apart in ways she could not fully control. She began spending 16-hour days in back-to-back calls with lawyers and lenders, coming to bed after midnight with the particular silence of someone managing something they are not ready to name out loud yet. Michael watched it unfold from close range and understood enough of what he was seeing to feel the ground shifting, but not enough to know how far it would go. Diane did not confide in him easily, not because she distrusted him, but because she had spent so many years handling things herself that vulnerability in professional matters felt to her like a structural failure she could not afford to allow. He asked questions and received partial answers. He made himself available and was not always taken up on it. And he had the increasingly uncomfortable experience of being the least important person in a house that was slowly filling up with a crisis he was not equipped to help solve. The full picture came on a Sunday evening in February, 4.5 years after Michael had walked out of Claire's life. Diane sat across from him at the marble kitchen table in Winchester and laid out the numbers with the controlled calm of someone who has had time to process shock and move to the other side of it. The flagship project was being returned to the lender. 2 additional properties were under serious financial strain and would require either emergency refinancing or sale. The company would survive, she told him, smaller, restructured, but intact. They would need to sell the house, the Range Rover, several of the other things that had made up the visible architecture of their life together. She said it all without flinching, because Diane Lawson had not built what she had built by flinching, and she was not about to start now. Michael sat with it. He listened to the full extent of it. He asked a few clarifying questions, and then he sat in the silence that followed and felt something move in him that had nothing at all to do with the financial situation. Something older and deeper and more honest than anything he had allowed himself to look at directly in years. He felt with sudden and startling clarity that he had spent 5 years of his life running toward a version of himself that was a mirage. That he had built his choices around what things looked like from the outside rather than what they felt like from the inside. That the woman he had left standing in a doorway holding a 6-week-old baby, the woman who had not asked anyone to witness her rebuilding, who had assembled a swing set alone on a Saturday afternoon, who had shown up to every school event and every sick day and every ordinary Tuesday of Lily's life without anyone to share the weight of it. That woman had always known something about who he was that he had been too frightened and too proud to acknowledge. And sitting at a marble table in a house he was about to lose, Michael Turner understood for the first time what it actually cost to have thrown that away. He called Claire in March. She let it go to voicemail. He left a message asking if they could talk. Not about Lily, not about logistics, just talk. Claire listened to the voicemail twice in the parking lot of the grocery store, sitting in her car with the engine off. Then she deleted it and went inside to get the things on Lily's school snack list for the week. She had a budget presentation to prepare for the following morning. She had a daughter who had just lost her first tooth and was absolutely convinced the tooth fairy was going to bring her enough money to buy a specific stuffed animal she had been asking about for 2 months. She had a life happening in full, and a voicemail from Michael Turner was not the most pressing item on the list. He called again 2 weeks later. This time Claire picked up. The conversation was brief and not particularly warm, though it was civil. They had maintained civility across 5 years for Lily's sake, and old habits hold even in new situations. He asked how she was. She said she was well. He asked about Lily. She gave him the standard update, the same kind of update she gave at pickup and drop-off. Age-appropriate progress, current interests, recent funny things said. Then Michael paused in a way that was different from the ordinary pauses in their conversations and said, "Can I come by sometime?" Not for Lily. Not for any of the usual reasons. "I just want to talk to you." There was a silence on the line long enough to carry meaning. Claire said, "I'll think about it." And both of them understood that this was not a yes, and also that it was not a no, and that the difference between those two things was going to be determined by something she had not yet fully decided. She spent 2 weeks thinking about it. She talked to Renee, who said what she had been saying in varying forms for 5 years. "Claire, you do not owe that man a single thing. Not a minute of your time, not an ounce of your grace. Nothing." She talked to her mother, who was quieter and more measured, who said, "Whatever you decide, baby, make sure you're deciding it for yourself." She talked to Paula, a friend she had made through Lily's playgroup who had become one of the most grounding voices in her life, a woman who asked better questions than she gave answers. And Paula looked at her over coffee one afternoon and said simply, "What do you actually want, Claire?" And for the first time in any of those conversations, Claire went quiet. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was more complicated than she had been letting herself admit. And sitting with complicated things honestly had always been where Claire did her most important work. He came on a Saturday afternoon in early April, 1 week before Lily's 5th birthday. Claire arranged for Lily to spend the afternoon at her mother's house, which Lily accepted with minimal negotiation because Grandma had a garden and a television situation that was slightly more permissive than the one at home. Claire made coffee because she needed something to do with her hands in the minutes before he arrived. She wore jeans and a plain navy sweater. She did not dress for him. She was not dressing for him. She opened the front door and Michael Turner was standing on the small painted porch of the house she had built her life inside. Not a grand house, not the kind of house with a wraparound porch and a wine cellar. Just a house, with a fenced backyard and a second-hand swing set and tomatoes coming up along the south wall. And it was, by every measure that Claire had learned to use, exactly enough. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped pretending the weight was manageable. He looked, in fact, like someone who had driven to this porch with something specific to say and was not sure, now that he was here, whether saying it was going to be received as the thing he meant it to be. Claire opened the door wider and stepped back, because she had decided to let him say what he came to say, and she was going to hear it fully, and that decision was hers and not a concession to him. He came in. He sat down at her kitchen table. He held the coffee mug she handed him with both hands, like a person holding something they are aware of being grateful for. And then he talked. Michael Turner told her the truth. Not the curated version of it. Not the version designed to produce a particular result. He said that he had been wrong. Not in the narrow way that means a specific mistake was made, but in the structural way, the way that reaches down into values and choices and the stories a person tells themselves about what they deserve. He told her he had spent 5 years running toward an image of success that had turned out to be a photograph of someone else's life, and that he had burned down something real to chase something that didn't hold. He told her that watching her, from the particular distance of pickup and drop-off, from the few dozen moments across 5 years where their paths crossed in the ordinary business of raising their daughter, had taught him more about character than anything he had bought or achieved in that time. He told her he had missed her. Not the idea of her. Not the comfort of her. Her specifically, her directness, her honesty, the way she made decisions from the inside out rather than the outside in, the way she had never once used Lily as a lever against him even when the leverage was fully available to her and nobody would have blamed her for using it. He said he was not there to make demands. He said he understood completely if she told him to get up and leave and never raise any of this again. He said he would not push. He said he just needed her to know where he stood, not for his own relief, not to transfer his guilt onto her, but because it was the honest thing, and he was trying, now, at this late hour, to make honesty the practice it should have always been. Then he stopped talking. He looked at the table for a moment, the small laminate table that was nothing like the marble one in Winchester, that was covered in a crayon drawing Lily had done of their family, stick figures with enormous heads, and a sun in the corner. And then he looked up at Claire and waited. Claire Matthews was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't know what to say. The quiet of someone who is choosing, deliberately, what to say first. She had imagined versions of this conversation many times across 5 years, usually late at night. Usually as she was drifting toward sleep. What she would tell him if he ever appeared, what she would want him to understand, whether she would be cold or forgiving or somewhere in the uncharted space between those two things. But sitting across from him now, with the coffee going cool between them and Lily's drawing on the table and the Saturday afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, none of those rehearsed versions felt true to the moment. So she said what was actually true. She told him she was glad he had said it. Not because it changed anything between them, but because she had spent 5 years carrying a question about whether he had ever understood what he had done, not to her, but fully, in himself, and knowing that he had was something she had not realized she still needed. She told him she did not hate him. She had moved through that particular season years ago, she said, because hating him required energy she had needed for other things. She told him that Lily loved him and that he was a good father in the time he was present, and that she had never wanted to damage that relationship for their daughter, and that she never would. She told him that the version of herself who had been waiting for this moment, the wounded version, the one who had needed his recognition to feel legitimate, had been gone for a long time, replaced by a woman who had learned at significant personal cost that her worth was not something he was capable of conferring or removing. And then Claire told him something that surprised him, and perhaps surprised her a little in the saying of it. She told him she forgave him, not as an invitation, not as an opening, not because he had earned it, or because she was ready to rewrite history. She told him she forgave him because she had come to understand that forgiveness was not something you gave another person. It was something you gave yourself. It was the act of choosing to put down a weight you had been carrying that was never truly yours to carry in the first place. She had carried it long enough. She was setting it down now, in this kitchen, in this conversation, on a Saturday afternoon in April with her daughter's crayon sun on the table between them. And she needed him to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that setting it down did not mean picking him back up. Michael left her house the same way he had arrived, without drama, without argument. He shook her hand in the hallway in a gesture that was awkward and genuine in equal measure, and she accepted it. He walked out to his car. A regular car now, not the company vehicle. And she watched from the kitchen window without quite deciding to, and she saw him sit in the driveway for a minute before he backed out and drove away. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel grief. She felt something she had earned the right to feel, something that took 5 years of early mornings and late nights and cereal aisle tears and solo swing set assemblies to arrive at. She felt like herself, completely, finally, and without apology. Lily turned 5 the following Saturday. Claire threw her a birthday party with a rainbow cake and 11 4-year-olds running through the backyard, and Michael was there, invited by Claire, because that was the mother she had decided to be. He chased Lily across the yard and picked her up and swung her in a circle while she screamed with joy, and set her back down, and she ran off immediately to the next thing without looking back, the way children do when they feel completely safe. He looked across the yard at Claire once, in the way a person looks when they are trying to hold on to something they are no longer entitled to hold. Claire gave him a small, calm nod. Not a promise, not a door, an acknowledgement, the kind that is honest enough to be kind and kind enough to be honest. What Claire Matthews built in 5 years was not a dramatic story of revenge. It was quieter than that, and more permanent. It was a career she had constructed from scratch during nap time and after bedtime. It was a house that was small and entirely hers, filled with plants along the south wall and a daughter's drawings on the refrigerator and a swing set in the backyard that she had put together herself. It was a self that she had rebuilt from the inside, not for anyone watching, not for any audience, not to prove anything to Michael Turner or Diane Lawson or the mutual friend who had sent her that newspaper article. For herself, for Lily, for the quiet, stubborn belief that what he had done to her was not the final word about who she was. The story of Claire Matthews is not a story about getting even. It is not a story about watching someone who hurt you finally receive what they deserve, though there is a human part of all of us that would understand if it were. It is a story about what happens when a woman decides, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the daily, unglamorous, accumulative way that real decisions are made, that her pain is not the end of her story. It is a story about what rebuilding actually costs and what you find when you get to the other side of it. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect ending with everything returned and restored. Something truer than that. A life that belongs to you. A self you recognize. A daughter who is being raised by someone who knows exactly who she is. Michael Turner is a changed man. Whether that change arrived in time, whether it reached deeply enough, whether it was ever fully directed at the right person, those questions do not have neat answers. What is clear is that the woman he left holding a 6-week-old baby on a dark doorstep is not the woman who stood in her kitchen 5 years later and chose to forgive him. That woman is not waiting for anyone. That woman stopped waiting a long time ago. She was too busy building something that mattered. There is a kind of strength the world does not celebrate as loudly as it should. The strength of a person who is left behind and decides, without an audience, without applause, to keep going anyway. Claire Matthews had that strength long before Michael walked out the door. He simply never looked closely enough to see it. And by the time he finally did, she had already become, fully and without him, everything she was always capable of being. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere out there, someone is standing in a doorway holding something heavy, wondering if they have what it takes to keep going. And the answer has always been yes. It always was. It always will be.